So in this week's module, we're going to give a kind of a brief overview or kind of a tour of key economic variables. And macroeconomic variables. So we're going to give some definitions. So it's very exciting, lots of definitions. And then in the live session, I kind of briefly gave an overview of kind of the recent history of these macroeconomic variables. In particular, we're going to concentrate on kind of the three pillars of macro, which is going to be output, price levels, about inflation, and employment. So we're going to kind of concentrate on these three pillars, and as I kind of try to underline in the live session this week, what we really want to do is concentrate on trends versus fluctuations. So we're thinking about both the long-term trends of these variables, so what's happening over a long period of time. So for example, is output increasing over a long period of time to give us some economic growth? So that's what we're thinking about trends, but we're also thinking about fluctuations, which have more to do with the business cycle. And kind of these short-term ups and downs of the business cycle. So this is kind of what this module is all about. We're going to start by talking about output. We're going to get into more detail about output and spend like a whole chapter or module next week talking about GDP and one measure of output in terms of how it's calculated and everything like that, what it includes, what it doesn't, before we kind of introduce a really simple model of the macroeconomy. But then we're going to talk about kind of these other variables as well, and you'll see them come up when we kind of introduce these models. They're going to kind of determine what's happening to employment and price levels and things like that. So the first macroeconomic variable that we're going to look at is output. And in particular, we're going to look at national product, which is going to be the value of all goods and services produced. So the national product of Canada would be all the goods and services produced in Canada. We're going to be more careful with our definition starting next week in terms of GDP and GNP and things like that. But a key idea that economists have is that all production has to lead to income. So the production of these goods leads to income. And so in that way, this national product, or what we might just call output, is going to be equal to national income. Just because the production of these goods and services is going to produce income for someone in that production process. And so, as I said, we're going to be more careful and kind of go through very carefully kind of one measure of national product, which is going to be GDP, next week. But for now, let's think about different ways we might calculate the value of goods and services produced. We can think of kind of two different ways. We can think of nominal output. Let's just say GDP or gross domestic product now, but we're going to kind of define that next week. Is going to be using like current prices times current output. So I'm just trying to make sure I stay in the screen. It's hard for me to tell how far the screen goes over here. So that's how we calculate nominal output. So think about like prices at time t times the quantity at times t. And we sum up all the different goods in the economy. So prices in 2019 times the quantities produced in 2019 would give us nominal output for 2019. Now we can also think of using a base year, and this would give us real output. So real GDP. use a base year prices. So how to calculate this would be the prices in the base year times the quantity at time t. So for instance, if we are interested in calculating 2019 GDP and we want to get the real GDP in 2019, we have to pick a base year. Let's say we use 2010 prices, and we multiply 2010 prices times 2019 quantities. And that would give us real GDP in 2019 using 2010 as a base year. And so what real GDP kind of accounts for is that price levels are changing over time. And so it's really trying to concentrate on changes in the underlying output rather than nominal output, which is going to include both price changes and quantity changes. So by fixing the price, all that's going to change, or all that's changing real GDP, is that changes in quantities. All right, so the next concept related to output we're going to talk about is potential output. And this is kind of often draws some confusion because potentials, people imagine like what you could do if you kind of gave everything and used every possible resource and there's zero unemployment, how much could we produce? But it's not, that's not what potential output is. Potential output is the output we get if we just used all of our factors of production to their normal, in their normal kind of utilization rates. How much output there would be if factors of production so think about capital, labor, those kind of things, were used at their normal rates. So normal utilizations. So it's not how much we could produce if everyone was employed, for instance. It's how much we produce if we had like the natural rate of unemployment. So it's often called like the full employment output. And again, that can be tricky, or that can be tricky for you to understand because full employment doesn't mean everyone's employed, because we have this natural rate of unemployment, which we'll talk about, where there's always some kind of unemployment, and so this would be like the output when we have this normal kind of rate of unemployment that happens because people are just between jobs and things like that. So that's what potential output is. So it's not how much we could produce if we work 24/7, 7 days a week. It's how much we'd produce if they were used to their normal rates. We often denote this potential output as Y star. And this lets us define the output gap, which is the difference between actual output, which we're going to denote with Y, and potential output. Y star. So it equals Y minus Y star. So when this is positive, when actual output or actual GDP is above potential output or potential GDP, we're going to say that there's an inflationary gap. So this is when the economy is like really booming, right? We have really low unemployment rates, things like that. We can also see that we could have our actual GDP below our potential. This is called a recessionary gap. So this is when the economy is not doing very well. The kind of unemployment's higher than its normal rate of the normal rate of unemployment, and the economy is producing less than its kind of potential in the sense of its normal utilization rates. So real GDP fluctuates around a rising trend. So if we are going to map out, use a graph to represent real GDP or real output, GDP, over time, we might have potential output rising like this. This is Y star, or potential output. And then we have the actual GDP of the economy kind of fluctuating around this trend. And so we're interested in both this steady trend up. This is about economic growth. This nice steady trend up of potential GDP. And what this oscillating thing around this rising trend, this is like the actual GDP, and this is what the business cycle is about. These ups and downs, these short-term ups and downs around this rising trend. So we're both interested in this rising trend and long-run growth, as well as understanding these business cycles and maybe how to kind of smooth these business cycles over. We might not want big, peaks and troughs of a business cycle. We want it to be kind of a steady kind of increase up of real GDP.